Most people assume disappearing is dramatic. But what if the real intensity lies in staying visible to those who slowly drain the energy out of you? There's a subtle moment that happens to certain individuals after years of constant interaction. One day, they begin to feel misunderstood by the people around them. Conversations start sounding repetitive. The laughter feels forced. Even notifications begin to feel intrusive. And without fully understanding why, they start craving distance. Not attention, distance. Carl Jung believed the human mind cannot hear itself clearly when surrounded by constant noise. Over time, the personality people constructed for survival becomes so loud that the authentic self disappears beneath it. So people keep performing, replying instantly, explaining themselves endlessly, maintaining friendships that emotionally ended years ago. Not because they want to, but because they fear what might happen when they finally go silent. Because silence reveals things. It reveals which relationships depended entirely on your availability. It shows how many people only feel connected to you when they have uninterrupted access to your attention. And most unsettling of all, it exposes the version of yourself you became just to remain accepted. Most people never realize how much of their personality is shaped around keeping others comfortable until they step away for a while. Then something uncomfortable begins to happen. The people who claim to care about you start reacting differently to your absence. Some grow irritated. Some become oddly distant. Others suddenly show renewed interest in you. Not because they truly miss you, but because your silence interrupted their psychological sense of control over your predictability. Predictable people make others feel safe. That's why society rewards over-explaining, emotional availability, and constant accessibility. Because a person who is always reachable is easier to emotionally manage. But the moment you withdraw, even briefly, people are forced to face something they dislike. They no longer know where they stand with you. And uncertainty makes people uneasy, especially those who benefited from your constant presence. Carl Jung understood that isolation is not always loneliness. Sometimes it is psychological recovery, a withdrawal from unconscious performance, a temporary ending of the false self. Because when you constantly surround yourself with people, you gradually lose the ability to distinguish who you truly are from who you became to socially survive. The unsettling part is that most people never realize this is happening. They spend years maintaining an identity unconsciously shaped by fear of rejection, fear of abandonment, fear of becoming invisible. But invisibility changes people. The moment nobody can constantly access you anymore, masks begin to fall, yours included. What you discover in that silence may permanently change how you view human nature. At first, disappearing feels wrong, almost like guilt. Your fingers instinctively reach for your phone. You wonder if people think you're being rude. You feel the urge to explain yourself before anyone even asks. That reaction alone reveals how deeply social conditioning has entered the mind. Somewhere along the way, many people were taught that constant availability equals goodness. That replying quickly means you care. That always being present makes you valuable. That stepping away makes you selfish. But Jung believed something deeper hides beneath this pattern. Most people are not afraid of losing others. They are afraid of being forgotten. So they remain emotionally accessible long after it begins damaging their inner world. They continue conversations they no longer enjoy, maintain friendships that feel hollow, laugh around people who quietly exhaust them. Slowly, they become strangers to themselves. The unsettling truth about prolonged social exposure is that human beings unconsciously adapt their personality to survive their environment. Around one group, you become softer. Around another, more entertaining. Around others, quieter. After enough time, you stop knowing which version is actually you. You only know which version keeps people comfortable. That's why isolation becomes psychologically frightening for some people. Because when the noise disappears, there's no audience left to perform for. And without an audience, the false self begins to weaken. This is where most people run back to distraction, back to texting, back to meaningless interaction, back to constant stimulation. Because silence is not peaceful at first. Silence is confrontation. You begin noticing things that were impossible to see before. How certain people only reached out when they needed emotional reassurance. How some friendships were built entirely on mutual distraction from loneliness. How often you betrayed your own boundaries just to avoid disappointing others. Kindness without boundaries quietly teaches people how to use you. And the worst part is, many don't even realize they're doing it. Human beings naturally move toward emotional convenience. If you always listen, they will always unload. If you always forgive, they will keep crossing lines. If you always stay, they will assume you'll never leave. Not because they are malicious, but because humans adapt quickly to access. That's why your absence unsettles people more than your anger ever could. Anger still gives them attention. Silence removes it. And silence forces people into uncertainty. Suddenly they begin wondering, did something change? Are you upset? Are you pulling away? But what truly disturbs them is not your absence. It's the realization that your world may continue without them at its center. People often confuse emotional possession with connection. They believe frequent access means intimacy. Constant communication means loyalty. Immediate replies mean love. But some of the deepest psychological bonds exist in silence, without performance, without maintenance, without constant reassurance. When you step away for a while, you begin separating real connection from dependency. That distinction changes everything. Because once you recognize how many relationships survive purely through habit and accessibility, you can never fully unsee it again. The mind becomes quieter, but also more detached. You start observing people differently, not through their words, but through their reactions to your boundaries. That's when the real shift begins. Not when you leave people, but when you begin to see them clearly. Distance does something powerful to perception. It removes emotional fog. The constant exposure fades. The endless conversations stop, and suddenly, patterns become visible that were always there. You notice who only spoke to you out of boredom, who subtly competed with you, who felt comfortable when you were insecure because it made them feel superior. And most disturbingly, you notice how often people reacted negatively the moment you stopped behaving the way they expected. Not openly, but subtly. Colder tones, delayed responses, passive-aggressive remarks disguised as humor, sudden emotional withdrawal. The human mind is extremely sensitive to shifts in control. When someone becomes less accessible, less predictable, less emotionally available, people instinctively feel it. Especially those who unconsciously relied on your consistency for their own emotional balance. This is why stepping back often changes social dynamics faster than self-improvement ever could. Because people can tolerate your growth. What they struggle with is losing psychological access to you. There's a reason mysterious individuals unsettle others. The mind feels safer around people it can fully predict. Once predictability disappears, projection begins. People start creating explanations for your silence. They think you've changed. They assume distance means arrogance. But maybe you simply stopped giving everyone unlimited access to your energy. Carl Jung believed much of human interaction operates unconsciously. People rarely understand the real reasons behind their emotions. They only feel the reaction itself. That's why some individuals become irritated when you start protecting your peace. Your boundaries force them to confront parts of themselves they were avoiding. The friend who only feels important when constantly needed. The person who depends on your attention to escape their own emptiness. The one who confuses emotional dependency with genuine closeness. Your silence reveals all of it. And silence has a way of exposing truths that words often hide. Sometimes you realize the people around you never truly knew you. They knew the version of you that was endlessly available. the one that tolerated everything, the one that sacrificed inner peace to maintain external harmony. But once that version fades, relationships begin to malfunction. Because many social bonds are quietly built on roles, not authenticity. One person plays the therapist, another plays the entertainer, another becomes the emotional caretaker. And the moment someone stops performing their assigned role, discomfort appears, sometimes even resentment, as if individuality itself feels like betrayal. Most relationships don't end when respect disappears. They end when awareness appears. Because awareness changes your tolerance. You stop romanticizing imbalance. Stop excusing manipulation. Stop chasing people who only value you when you're easy to access. And strangely, the more comfortable you become with solitude, the more clearly you begin to understand human nature. Not in a bitter way, but in a detached one. You begin realizing that many people are not connected through emotion, but through unconscious needs. Validation, attention, security, distraction from themselves. Once you see this, ordinary conversations begin to feel different, almost surreal. Beneath casual interaction, you start sensing the hidden psychological exchanges happening constantly. Who seeks approval? Who seeks control? Who fears abandonment? Who hides resentment behind politeness? Most people never notice these layers because they never stay silent long enough to observe them. The longer you remain distant, the stranger the world begins to feel. Not because people changed, but because your perception did. You begin to see how much of modern life is designed to keep people mentally occupied at all times. Constant messages, constant updates, constant interaction. An endless stream of noise preventing anyone from sitting alone long enough to face themselves. And that confrontation is exactly what Jung believed most people spend their entire lives trying to avoid. Because beneath the social personality, beneath the carefully constructed image, there is something far less comfortable waiting quietly in silence. The shadow, not evil, just rejected. The parts of yourself you buried in order to remain accepted by others. Your anger, your ambition, your envy, your emotional exhaustion, your quiet desire to disappear from everyone without explanation. Most people suppress these feelings immediately. They label them toxic, selfish, wrong. But suppression does not erase anything psychologically. It only pushes it deeper into the unconscious, where it begins influencing behavior indirectly. That is why some people suddenly explode after years of being agreeable. Why certain individuals become emotionally numb without understanding the cause. Why people wake up one day feeling disconnected from their own life. The shadow was ignored for too long, and silence forces you to face it. This is the stage where disappearing becomes genuinely uncomfortable, because eventually there is nobody left to blame, no distractions remaining, no constant conversations to drown out your thoughts. Only you and the parts of yourself you spent years avoiding. You begin noticing how often your kindness was driven by fear. How many of your relationships were maintained out of guilt? How much of your personality was shaped around avoiding rejection? That realization alone can fracture someone internally, because people want to believe their identity is authentic and fully chosen. But deep isolation often reveals something more unsettling. Large portions of the personality are adaptations, social survival mechanisms repeated so often they began to feel real. The agreeable version of you, the humorous version, the emotionally available version. Masks, useful masks, but still masks. And once you become aware of them, social interaction changes permanently. You start hearing manipulation hidden inside ordinary conversations. Not always intentional manipulation, but unconscious patterns. People subtly testing boundaries, seeking reassurance, fishing for validation, attempting to maintain emotional control over how they are perceived. Human beings do this constantly. Most are simply unaware of it. The unsettling part is realizing that you do it as well. Carl Jung warned that people who only see darkness in others remain unconscious of their own shadow. True awareness begins the moment you recognize the same psychological patterns within yourself. The need for validation, the desire to be admired, the quiet resentment toward those who overlooked you, the subtle satisfaction of being missed after disappearing. None of it makes you evil, it makes you human. And this is where many misunderstand isolation completely. Isolation is not about becoming superior to others. It is about seeing yourself without distortion for the first time. That process is painful, because the ego depends on illusion to remain comfortable. But the illusion begins collapsing in silence. You start understanding why certain people constantly surround themselves with noise, relationships, entertainment, substances, attention. Because if they ever truly stopped, they might meet the person beneath the performance. And they are afraid that person may feel empty, angry, or lost. So they keep running. Most people are not addicted to social media. They are addicted to escaping themselves. And once you realize that, the world becomes impossible to see the same way again. After enough time alone, something colder begins forming in the mind. You stop craving explanations from others. The need to defend yourself weakens. The urge to correct misunderstandings fades. Even approval starts losing its emotional weight. Not because you became emotionless, but because you finally saw how fragile human perception actually is. People rarely see you as you truly are. They see you through the lens of their own needs, insecurities, and unresolved wounds. To one person, your silence feels arrogant. To another, mysterious. To someone else, threatening. The same behavior, different interpretations. And once you understand this, you begin wasting less energy trying to control how others perceive you. Because perception was never fully in your control to begin with. Carl Jung believed that until people become conscious of their unconscious patterns, those patterns will control their life, and they will call it fate. That is exactly what happens in most relationships. People repeat emotional cycles without ever recognizing them. The one who constantly chases emotionally unavailable people. The one who confuses being needed with being loved. The one who keeps sacrificing themselves, hoping loyalty will eventually be returned. These are patterns, not destiny. And isolation exposes patterns brutally, especially those involving attachment. Because when you step away from everyone for a while, withdrawal begins, not just for others, but for you as well. You start reaching for your phone without reason, wondering who noticed your absence, imagining conversations that never happened. That is when you realize something unsettling. Constant communication was not always connection. Sometimes it was addiction, a loop of emotional stimulation keeping the mind occupied. Notifications become small psychological reassurances. Replies become proof of significance. Attention becomes emotional oxygen. Remove it suddenly, and people begin to panic internally. Not because they lost connection, but because they lost distraction. This is why solitude feels unbearable to many individuals. In silence, there are no interruptions protecting you from your own thoughts. No validation, no performance, no escape, only awareness. And awareness changes a person permanently. You begin seeing social interaction almost like theater. Everyone managing impressions, hiding insecurities behind personality, projecting confidence while privately struggling with confusion. Some hide emptiness through humor, others through intelligence, some through dominance, beauty, success, or constant relationships. But nearly everyone is hiding something. That is the uncomfortable truth isolation reveals. Human beings are psychologically fragile creatures, pretending to feel secure. And society quietly rewards the people most skilled at maintaining that performance. But every performance has a cost. Some lose authenticity, some lose peace, some lose themselves entirely. The disturbing part is that many never realize it happened. They become so dependent on external validation that being alone with themselves feels psychologically threatening. So they continue surrounding themselves with noise until life ends, never truly meeting themselves even once. Jung understood that individuation, becoming your true self, requires separation from collective expectations, which means at some point you will disappoint people. You will become less available, less explainable, less eager to maintain every connection. And certain individuals will resent you for it, not because you harmed them, but because your transformation forces them to confront their own stagnation. People do not resent your boundaries. They resent the version of themselves your boundaries expose. And sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is quietly withdraw long enough to hear your own mind again. Because if you never separate yourself from the noise, you may spend your entire life confusing who you are with who the world rewarded you for being. Eventually, you return, not dramatically. Most people will not even notice the exact moment it happens, but you notice it because something inside you no longer moves the same way. The old hunger for constant connection weakens. You stop needing every message answered immediately. You stop feeling responsible for maintaining every relationship. And for the first time, you begin understanding the difference between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness is the pain of being unseen. Solitude is the peace of seeing yourself clearly. Most people never reach that distinction. They spend their lives fearing silence because silence removes witnesses from their identity. Without constant interaction, they no longer know who they are. That is why so many people react strongly when someone disappears. Not because absence is cruel, but because absence interrupts psychological dependency. When access disappears, reality surfaces. The friend who only called when they needed emotional support slowly fades away. The people who claimed they cared suddenly stop reaching out. The ones who truly valued you remain quietly, without demanding constant proof of your availability. That realization reshapes the structure of your relationships permanently. You become more selective, not out of ego, but out of awareness. Because once you see how many interactions are built on unconscious emotional exchanges, you stop romanticizing connection blindly. You begin understanding that some people love attention more than intimacy. Some value control more than genuine connection. Some only feel close to others when they are emotionally needed by them. And many people who say they miss you are really saying, "I miss access to how you made me feel." There is a difference, a painful one, but an important one. Carl Jung believed the privilege of a lifetime is becoming who you truly are. What most people ignore is how psychologically intense that process can be. Because becoming yourself often requires destroying versions of yourself that kept others comfortable. The agreeable version, the endlessly available version, the version afraid to disappoint anyone. And not everyone will appreciate what emerges afterward. Some people only love the parts of you they could influence. The moment they can no longer predict your reactions, your emotions, or your availability, tension begins to appear.